That's the part nobody talks about. Not the affair, not the empire, not the years of silence that built into something sharp enough to cut a man's entire world in half. They talk about the power. They talk about the names, Moretti, the commission, the 5 families. But they never talk about the moment Dante laughed, because that laugh is where this story actually starts, and where Dante Moretti's story quietly, irreversibly ends. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every second of this matters. Part 1. The morning light came in sideways through the tall windows of the Moretti estate, cutting pale gold lines across marble floors that cost more than most men earned in a decade. It was the kind of light that made everything look clean, permanent. Like the house itself had always existed and always would, indifferent to whatever happened inside its walls. Vivian Ashcroft Moretti had been awake since 4. She hadn't slept well in 2 years, but this morning was different. This morning she'd made coffee, real coffee, not the espresso the household staff prepared each morning at 6:15 precisely, not the ritual that Dante had installed in their lives like a small daily reminder that everything in this house operated on his schedule. She'd made it herself, standing barefoot in the kitchen at 4:15 while the rest of the estate slept, and she'd drunk it slowly, standing at the window that looked out over the rear garden, watching the darkness lose its grip on the lawn inch by inch. She'd thought about a lot of things in those hours. She hadn't cried. That surprised her once, years ago, the absence of tears. Now it didn't surprise her at all. There was nothing left inside her chest that needed releasing that way. What she felt now was more like the sensation of setting down something very heavy after carrying it so long you'd forgotten it was there. A slow, structural relief, the kind that goes all the way down into the bones. By 6 o'clock, she was in the bedroom, moving through it the way she moved through everything in the last 2 years. Quietly, methodically, without wasted motion. The last of her personal items had already been sorted and boxed over 3 separate nights across the previous week, while Dante slept, or was away, or was where he increasingly was when he was supposed to be somewhere else. The boxes were already in the trunk of her car. She'd moved them herself, one at a time, at 3 in the morning, using the side door near the kitchen that the overnight security detail didn't cover between 2:45 and 4:10, a gap she'd mapped over 6 months of careful observation. What remained in the bedroom this morning was minimal. A few pieces of jewelry that had been her mother's, kept in a small velvet pouch she'd left in the lining of a coat hanging in the back of her closet. 3 books. A photograph she'd kept not for sentiment, but because it showed her standing next to Carmine Moretti, Dante's father, at the signing of a particular family document 11 years ago, and the date on that photograph mattered. She took the photograph carefully, slid it into the interior pocket of the charcoal wool coat she was wearing. She made one last pass through the room, not because she'd missed anything. She hadn't missed anything, but because she'd decided weeks ago that she would let herself have this. One slow look, not at what she was leaving, at what the room actually was. Expensive, immaculate, and entirely without warmth. A display case for a marriage that had been theater for years longer than she'd wanted to admit. She let the look last about 4 seconds. Then she walked out. The sound was coming from the east wing before she reached the bottom of the staircase. The Moretti estate's east wing had been Dante's unofficial domain since the 3rd year of their marriage. He conducted business there, kept his private study there, entertained associates there in the evenings when Vivian had long since removed herself to the west-facing sitting room with a book she sometimes actually read. She had not been inside the East Wing in 5 months, not since the last time she'd walked in on a phone call that Dante had ended too quickly, his body rotating away from her with the practiced ease of a man who had been keeping secrets so long it had become physical reflex. But she knew the East Wing well. She knew the layout, the acoustics, which rooms carried sound and which swallowed it. She knew, for instance, that the small morning room at the end of the east corridor, the one with the French doors that opened onto the garden terrace, had plaster walls and hardwood floors that amplified sound in a very specific way. She knew this because she'd spent a great deal of time, over the past 2 years, paying attention to things that Dante assumed she wasn't paying attention to. She didn't slow her walk toward the front door. She didn't stop, but she let herself hear it. Dante's voice, lower than usual, carrying that particular texture it had when he was relaxed and performing at the same time. The voice he used when he wanted someone to feel like he was giving them something personal. She'd heard that voice on their second date, on a rooftop in Manhattan, when she'd believed it was real. And the other voice, a woman's, light, bright, strategically unguarded. Then the laugh, Dante's laugh, full, unguarded, genuine. More genuine than anything she'd heard from him in years. Easy and warm and completely, carelessly loud, at 6:40 in the morning, in the room at the end of his wing, while his wife carried the last of her belongings toward the front door. Vivian Ashcroft Moretti paused at the foot of the staircase. Not because the laugh surprised her, not because it hurt the way it might have once, in some earlier version of herself she'd largely finished mourning. She paused because she wanted to be precise about what she was feeling in that moment, and she'd learned over the last 2 years that precision mattered, that naming a thing accurately was part of how you made it useful. What she felt, she decided, was confirmation. Not pain, not rage. Confirmation, clean and quiet. Like a key turning in a lock she'd built herself over a very long time. She walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside into the cold October morning air. She did not look back. The door closed behind her with a sound that was almost nothing, a whisper of oak and brass, the kind of sound that a house makes settling or a season changing. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove. Dante Moretti did not realize his wife had left until 40 minutes after she was gone. This was itself a piece of information. He found it out not because he went looking for her, or called for her, or noticed her absence as an absence, but because one of the household staff, a woman named Agnes, who had worked in the Moretti estate for 11 years, and who had always, Vivian later reflected, treated Vivian with the particular careful respect of someone who suspected they were watching a slow catastrophe. Agnes had knocked on the East Wing morning room door at 7:20 and reported quietly that Mrs. Moretti's car was gone from the garage and her usual coffee service hadn't been touched. Dante, according to the account that filtered back through sources Vivian had spent considerable time cultivating, told Agnes he was sure she'd just gone for an early errand and to leave the coffee service. He was still confident an hour later. Still confident enough to make 2 phone calls, conduct a video meeting with his financial liaison in London, and eat a breakfast of eggs and toast prepared by the household cook. An unremarkable morning, the kind that follows a man around when he's never had serious reason to believe the world won't arrange itself the way he's arranged it. He drove back to the estate at 2 in the afternoon, after a lunch meeting in Midtown at a restaurant he used for semi-private business discussions. A place he controlled the reservation list for, where the corner booth was kept for him, regardless of occupancy, where the staff had been instructed over the years through a combination of generous tips and the particular kind of implication that doesn't require words. The estate was quiet when he walked in. Agnes was in the main hallway. Her hands were folded in front of her in a way that Dante, who prided himself on reading people, who had built a criminal empire in part on his ability to understand what a man's body was doing even when his mouth was saying something else, should have recognized as significant. He did not recognize it, or perhaps he saw it and chose not to see it, which was its own kind of information. "Where is she?" he said. Not a greeting, a check-in, the casual authority of a man asking about inventory. "I don't believe Mrs. Moretti is here, sir," Agnes said. He looked at her for a moment, looked at the hallway around him. Then he walked through the house the way a man walks when he already knows what he'll find but isn't quite willing to commit to knowing it yet, quickly, with too much purpose, checking rooms with a rhythm that was less search and more proof. The west-facing sitting room, the bedroom, the small dressing room adjacent to the bedroom where Vivian's clothes had hung in ordered rows for 14 years. Empty. Not empty the way a room is empty when its occupant has stepped out. Empty the way a room is empty when someone has made a decision about it. He stood in the dressing room for a long moment. The hangers were still there. Everything was still precisely arranged. She hadn't ransacked it, hadn't pulled things chaotically off shelves. She'd taken what she wanted with the same quiet deliberateness that characterized everything she did, and left the rest undisturbed, which somehow made it worse: the order of it. The evidence that she hadn't been frantic or emotional, that she'd thought about this. He went back downstairs. The envelope was on the dining room table. He almost walked past it. It was a standard manila envelope, letter-sized, sealed, his name written on the front in Vivian's handwriting. Neat, precise, the penmanship of a woman who'd grown up in a household where presentation mattered. He stood in front of it for a moment without touching it. Then he sat down at the table, pulled it toward him, opened it. 3 things inside. The first, divorce papers. 34 pages, prepared by a firm he didn't recognize, which meant she'd gone outside his network, gone around the lawyers he had relationships with, the ones who called him after initial consultations with Moretti wives and ex-wives and anyone adjacent to his world who might walk through their doors. She'd found counsel he couldn't see. He stared at the first page for a while, at the careful legal language of a woman who had decided to be very, very precise about this particular transaction. The second, photographs. Hundreds of them. He emptied them onto the dining table, and they fanned out across the surface in overlapping layers, time-stamped, dated, showing him and Carla Voss in restaurants, in hotel corridors, in the private parking structure she used at the building where she worked for his consigliere, Marco Iannetti. Showing them together at times when he'd told Vivian he was in meetings in New Jersey, in Chicago, in places that had functioned as convenient architecture for a year and a half of sustained dishonesty. The photographs were not angry. That was the thing. They were just thorough. Whoever had taken them, and he ran through the possibilities fast, his mind going professional and cold the way it did under threat before the personal layer caught up, had been patient and invisible and completely systematic. There was no gap in the timeline, no missing week. The coverage was total. He set the photographs down. The third item in the envelope was a single sheet of paper, not a legal document, not a photograph. A typed document, 4 paragraphs with 2 attachments. A photocopy of an agreement signed 47 years ago by the founding members of the Moretti Syndicate, including his father Carmine Moretti, and a separate notarized document dated 9 years ago, in the final months of Carmine Moretti's life, that he had never seen, had never known existed, that he was looking at now for the first time. He read the 4 paragraphs twice. Then he read them again. He sat very still for a long time. Outside, through the tall windows of the dining room, the afternoon light was going amber, and the lawn was doing what lawns do in October, the color leaving quietly, the season making its position known without drama. Dante Moretti sat at the dining room table with 3 things in front of him and understood for the first time that he'd been living in someone else's house. Masen. The founding agreement of the Moretti Syndicate was not common knowledge, even within the organization. That was deliberate. Carmine Moretti had been a man who understood that power has 2 components, the power itself and the perception of the power, and that sometimes protecting the perception required keeping the mechanics hidden. What the founding agreement established, in language that was dense and archaic, and had clearly been drafted by someone who understood exactly what they were doing, was a succession structure rooted in Moretti bloodline seniority. Not seniority by birth order, not seniority by gender, seniority by bloodline verification through the original founding family's lineage, a structure that traced back to Carmine's mother's side, the Sordello family, who had brought the original capital and the original network to the partnership that became the Moretti Syndicate. Carmine Moretti had married a Sordello, Dante's mother. This was common knowledge. What was not common knowledge, what was in fact known to almost no one, was that Carmine Moretti, in the last year of his life, had done something very careful and very deliberate with regard to the succession document. He'd added a provision, private, notarized, witnessed by 2 men who had since died, deposited with an attorney whose name appeared nowhere in any of the family's operational records. The provision established that in the event of conduct by the sitting head of the Moretti Syndicate that could be demonstrated to violate the founding principles of the organization, specifically diversion of syndicate assets for personal use, breach of agreements with affiliated families, conduct demonstrating fundamental unsuitability for leadership, the Bloodline Succession Authority could be invoked. And the Bloodline Succession Authority, as established by the founding agreement, did not run through Dante. It ran through Vivian. Not because Vivian was a Moretti by birth, She wasn't. But because Carmine Moretti had, in the 9 months before his death, apparently come to understand something about his daughter-in-law that his son had never bothered to understand about his wife, and had made arrangements accordingly. The provision designated Vivian Ashcroft as the holder of majority voting authority over the syndicate's succession decisions, operating through a mechanism that required demonstration of cause and verification by the Commission. The cause provision. Dante had diverted syndicate assets for personal use for years. This was not a secret within the organization, though it was managed carefully. He'd funded projects that benefited him personally through accounts that were technically syndicate operational funds. He'd structured payments in ways that blurred the line between his personal income and the organization's treasury in ways that should have been flagged but weren't, because the people who might have flagged them understood who they were working for. The photographs on the table were not just of an affair. He went through them again, slower this time, and he saw what he hadn't seen the first time, when he'd been focused on Carla, on the proof of what he'd done. The other photographs. The ones that weren't of him and Carla. The ones that were of accounts, of transfers, of meetings with men who managed his personal holdings, of documents being signed. She documented everything, 2 years of it, possibly longer. He put the photographs down and looked at the dining room wall for a while, and what he felt was not quite fear. Fear was something that came on fast, that had a physical texture, that he'd learned to recognize in himself and others and manage accordingly. What he felt was more like standing at the edge of something he'd thought was solid ground and feeling it shift, a geological thing, a thing happening at a level below where he normally operated. He picked up his phone and called Marco Iannetti. The call rang 5 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called the cell number he used for emergencies, a number he'd given Marco 11 years ago and used fewer than 10 times. The emergency line, the one that was supposed to be answered regardless. It rang 8 times. No answer. No voicemail. Dante sat at his dining room table in his large, quiet house and listened to the silence on the other end of an emergency line that no one was picking up. And he understood that the world had changed while he was eating breakfast and laughing in the East Wing morning room. He just didn't know yet how completely. Carla Voss had been working for Marco Iannetti for 3 years when Dante Moretti first paid serious attention to her. She was 29 at the time, efficient, intelligent in the way that expresses itself as quickness rather than depth, ambitious with the particular precision of someone who has spent their whole life figuring out which rooms to be in. She was good at her job, genuinely good at it, not good in the performed way of someone managing perception, and she had the quality that Dante had always, to his consistent personal detriment, interpreted as substance, the ability to mirror back whatever version of himself he most wanted to see. He'd been careful at first. As careful as a man like Dante Moretti was capable of being, which was less careful than he believed. He conducted the affair with the organization and management skills he applied to professional situations, and because the people around him were accustomed to not seeing what they weren't supposed to see. The early months had been relatively contained. Vivian had known within 4 months. This was something she'd decided later not to advertise. Not because she was ashamed of how long it took her to find out, but because she understood that information is most useful when the person it concerns doesn't know you have it. She'd known within 4 months, and she'd spent the following 20 months deciding what to do with knowing. She'd done a great deal in those 20 months. Carla Voss sat at her desk on the 31st floor of the building in Midtown, where Marco Iannetti maintained the legitimate financial advisory practice that served as the front end of approximately a third of the Moretti Syndicate's money management. And she was looking at her phone at 2:50 in the afternoon of the day that Dante Moretti sat in his dining room reading an envelope. And she was reading a text message from a number she didn't recognize that contained 11 words and a photograph. The 11 words were, "He doesn't have it anymore. You should know this now." The photograph was of the first page of the founding agreement provision, the notarized document, just the first page with the key section highlighted in yellow. She read the text message 3 times. Then she set her phone face down on her desk and looked at the wall of glass that constituted the east side of her office, through which the Manhattan skyline presented itself in the cold afternoon light in the way it always did, indifferent, vast, organized around the concerns of people with serious money. And she performed a rapid, unsentimental audit of her position. She'd taken risks with this. Calculated risks, she'd told herself. Not the risks of a woman in love, not the risks of someone operating on feeling, but the strategic risks of a woman who had identified an adjacent power structure and made a decision to be useful to it. She'd been useful to Dante. She had never confused that for safety. The question was how much of that usefulness transferred. The question, more precisely, was whether the person who'd sent this text was someone she could be useful to next. She picked up her phone, looked at the number again. It wasn't in her contacts. She had no way to trace it. Whoever had sent it had put the information in front of her and left the decision entirely with her. She made a decision. She opened her calendar and began clearing the next 3 weeks of commitments. Whoa. Vivian drove for 2 hours before she stopped. Not because she needed gas or was lost or had run out of road. She drove because she had earned the right to 2 unstructured hours. Hours that belonged to no schedule and no person and no organizational calculation, and she had decided in advance to take them. She'd decided a lot of things in advance over the past 2 years. This was one of the smaller ones, but she'd looked forward to it in a way that surprised her with its specificity. The 2 hours. The empty road. The radio on something she'd chosen herself. She stopped at a rest area off a highway in Connecticut, not because Connecticut meant anything, but because it was there. And she got out and stood in the cold for a few minutes with her coat pulled around her, watching the late afternoon traffic move past, and she let herself feel, with some precision, the full shape of what she'd done. There was a grief in it. Not for Dante. She'd grieved Dante, or the idea of Dante, or the person she'd believed at 28 that Dante was, long ago, in small doses over the course of years, in the way you grieve things that end slowly. What she felt now was something more structural. The grief of having spent 14 years in a particular form and now standing outside it, the body's resistance to the removal of a shape it had learned. She stood there for about 5 minutes. Then she got back in the car, picked up her phone, and called a number she'd had memorized for 4 months. It answered on the second ring. "It's done," she said. A pause on the other end, then, "We're ready." "The envelope was left at 2:15. He'll have been back by now." "I know. We've been watching the house." "And Marco?" "Marco got a call 40 minutes ago. He didn't answer." She nodded, though there was no one to see it. "Good. The commission contact in Boston says they can do Friday for a preliminary call. It doesn't have to be in person for the first conversation. Make it Thursday," she said, "and make it in person." Another pause. Shorter this time. "That's fast." "I know." "Are you sure?" Vivian looked out through the windshield at the rest area, at the vending machines lit up against the dimming afternoon sky, at a man in a fleece jacket walking a dog along the concrete path that ran along the perimeter, at the ordinary ongoing texture of a world that had nothing to do with any of this. "I spent 2 years being patient," she said. "I'm done being patient." She ended the call. The man on the other end of that call was Luca Romano, and she'd been working with him for 14 months. Luca Romano was 37 years old and had spent the first decade of his professional life as an attorney, criminal defense primarily, which meant he understood the architecture of criminal enterprise from the outside in, understood where the structures held and where they were paper, understood what information could do when it was gathered correctly and deployed at the right moment. He'd left private practice 8 years ago under circumstances that his former firm would not discuss, and had spent the years since working as what could most accurately be described as a strategic consultant for people who needed the kind of advice that couldn't be given in formal settings. Vivian had found him through a referral from a woman named Estelle Vargas, who ran a legitimate import-export operation in Miami that had historically had arrangements with 3 of the 5 families, and who had, over the preceding 7 years, gradually and quietly restructured those arrangements until they were entirely on her own terms. Estelle was 61 years old and had the particular kind of authority that comes from having spent decades being underestimated. And when Vivian had sat across from her at a hotel restaurant in Miami 14 months ago and explained in broad terms what she was trying to accomplish, Estelle had listened to the whole thing without interruption and then said simply, "Call Luca Romano." Luca Romano was, on paper, exactly what Vivienne needed. Someone who understood organizational structure, understood the commission's mechanisms, understood succession law as it applied to the specific arcane traditions of the five families' founding documents, and who had absolutely no prior relationship with Dante Moretti or anyone in his inner circle. He was also in practice one of the most careful people she'd ever worked with. He did not take shortcuts. He did not let her take shortcuts. He pushed back on her timeline twice in the first 3 months, both times correctly. He understood that the thing she was trying to do could not be done fast and could not be done angry, and he was willing to tell her this in the particular flat, unapologetic way that she'd come to depend on. The voice of someone who was on your side and therefore not going to tell you what you wanted to hear when what you wanted to hear was wrong. By the time she walked out of the Moretti estate on a Tuesday morning in October, she and Luca Romano had spent 14 months building something that looked, from certain angles, like a legal case, and from other angles like a coup, and from the angle Vivienne herself preferred to view it from, like a correction. Tortich. The call to Marco Ianetti went through at 4:47. Marco had, in fact, been receiving calls all afternoon, but he'd let Dante's calls go because he'd received his own envelope, not identical to Vivienne's, but related. His had arrived by courier at 3:15, addressed to him personally, and it had contained a document he recognized immediately, a summary of the founding agreement provision with specific reference to the sections that applied to the consigliere's obligations in the event of a succession challenge. Marco Ianetti had been Dante Moretti's consigliere for 9 years. He was a man of significant intelligence and significant caution, and the combination of those qualities meant that when he read the summary document at 3:15 and understood what it was, his first thought was not loyalty, and it was not betrayal. His first thought was geometry, the shape of the situation, the vectors available to him. He'd spent 90 minutes with those vectors before he picked up his phone, not to call Dante, to call a number he'd had for 4 months, given to him by someone he trusted, with the instruction to use it if circumstances ever arrived that matched a particular description. Those circumstances had now arrived. The number connected to Luca Romano, who answered on the first ring. "I got the document," Marco said. "I know," Luca said. "I need to understand what's being asked." "Nothing's being asked. You're being informed. What you do with the information is your decision." Marco was quiet for a moment. He was standing in the window of his office, looking down at the street 31 floors below, watching the specific, anonymous movement of people who didn't know who he was and had no stake in any of this. "She's serious," he said. "It wasn't really a question. She's been serious for 2 years, Luca said. You just didn't know she was working." Marco processed this. "The commission will be contacted Thursday, in person." "That's—" Marco stopped, started again. "That's fast." "She's done being patient." Another long pause. Marco heard through the glass the muffled percussion of the city. "What does she need from me?" he said. "Right now, nothing. She's not asking anyone to do anything right now. She's simply making sure everyone has accurate information about the situation." "And later?" "Later," Luca said, "she'll be running the organization, and she'll need a consigliere who understands structure and knows where the bodies are buried, in the non-literal sense." Marco thought about this. He thought about 9 years with Dante Moretti, 9 years of managing a man who was talented enough to be dangerous and limited enough to be reckless. 9 years of watching syndicate assets move in ways that made Marco's teeth ache. 9 years of Carla Voss, 9 years of a man who laughed too loudly in the mornings and assumed the silence around him was agreement. "Tell her I'll need a sit-down," Marco said. "Not by phone." "I'll pass that along," Luca said. "She expected you'd say that." The call ended. Marco Ianetti set his phone on his desk and looked at the photograph of himself, Dante, and Carmine Moretti that had sat in a silver frame on his bookshelf for 11 years. The three of them at a dinner after the commission's last formal reorganization, Carmine in the middle, his hand on Marco's shoulder, Dante to his left, all of them facing the camera with the composed expressions of men who understood that documented moments carry weight. He looked at Carmine Moretti's face for a long time. Then he reached out and laid the photograph face down on the shelf. Dante Moretti made 7 calls between 3 and 6 in the evening. He reached 2 of them. Both conversations were short, and both had the quality that Dante recognized from years of conducting difficult conversations. The quality of someone who already knows the conclusion and is waiting for you to arrive at it. His head capo in Brooklyn, a man named Vincent Curro, whom he'd known for 20 years, took his call, spoke with him for approximately 4 minutes, and told him he thought it would be best if they spoke in person before anything else, which was not what Dante had asked for, which was immediate loyalty confirmation and operational status, and which told Dante something specific about where Vincent Curro currently stood. His personal attorney, Gerald Marsh, took his second call. Gerald Marsh had represented Dante Moretti personally for 7 years. He was not a criminal attorney. Dante had separate counsel for organizational matters, but he was the man Dante used for personal transactions, personal documents, the ordinary legal architecture of a wealthy man's private life. Gerald Marsh told him he was unable to represent him in any matter connected to the Moretti family succession, as he had a conflict of interest. "What conflict?" Dante said. "I'm not in a position to disclose that," Gerald said. "I'm sorry, Dante." Gerald Marsh had 9 months ago received a visit from a woman he'd known for 14 years, a client's wife, someone he'd met at functions, someone he'd always regarded with a mild professional respect that had not, until that visit, required much attention. In that visit, she'd presented him with a choice, had laid out the situation with remarkable clarity and zero theatrics, and had asked him to make a decision about where he stood. Gerald Marsh had a family. He had a practice he'd built over 30 years. He had no romantic illusions about the world Dante Moretti operated in or the people that world produced. And Vivian Ashcroft Moretti had sat across from him in a conference room and spoken about the situation with such measured, factual precision that it had not felt like a threat and had not felt like a plea, and had felt, very specifically, like information being given to someone who deserved to have it. He'd called her back 3 days later. The 5 calls Dante couldn't get through to went to voicemail. He did not leave messages on 4 of them. On the 5th, his personal contact at the commission, a man in his 60s who served as an informal liaison between the New York families and the larger organizational structure, he left a brief message requesting an urgent call. He would not receive a return call on that number for 6 days. When the return call eventually came, it would not be from the man he'd called. He sat in the study in the east wing with the lights going dim around him as evening came on, and he thought with the methodical, stripped-down clarity that arrives sometimes in the aftermath of shock. The kind of thinking that happens when the ordinary noise of confidence goes quiet and you're left with only the mechanics of the situation. She'd spent 2 years on this. That was the fact that kept returning to him, pressing in from every direction he tried to think around it. 2 years. 2 years of sitting across from him at their dining table, driving to appointments, attending functions where she stood next to him in the particular composed, unhurried way that he'd always interpreted as contentment, or maybe passivity, or maybe simple absence of interiority. 2 years of that while building this. He'd never asked what she was doing with her time. He'd never asked because he'd never thought about it. She was there. She managed the household. She appeared where she was supposed to appear. The rest of her interior life had not, in genuine truth, been a thing he'd considered having much material substance. That, he understood now, was the mechanism. Not her skill, though she had skill. Not the legal architecture she'd constructed, though it was apparently formidable. The mechanism was his own assumption. His consistent, total, completely unreflective assumption that the quiet woman who moved through his house without drama and packed her belongings without a raised voice and left without a scene was a woman who wasn't doing anything. He'd handed her the weapon himself, 2 years of handing it to her, laughing in the morning room while she walked out, laughing at the irrelevance of a woman he'd already, in his private arithmetic, categorized as the least important person in his own house. He understood this now. He sat in the quiet study with the understanding of it, and what it produced in him was not grief and not contrition, and not, precisely, fear. It was something older than those things, something closer to the physical sensation of ground that was no longer there. He thought about Carmine Moretti, his father. The man who had built this organization from 4 street crews and a fish market in Carroll Gardens into a structure that had survived 40 years and 7 commission reorganizations and 2 federal investigations that had taken down 3 of the other families. The man who had looked at Vivian Ashcroft at the dinner where Dante brought her for the first time and had said nothing that evening but had called Dante the next morning and said, in the deliberate, careful way that Carmine used when he considered a thing worth considering, "She's the smartest person in any room she walks into. Make sure you understand what that means before you do anything stupid." Dante had thought his father was complimenting him on his taste. He sat in the study with the lights going dim and looked at the wall across from him, and the envelope was still on the dining room table. And outside the windows, the estate was settling into autumn dark, and the empire that Dante Moretti had run for 9 years since his father's death was in the process of very quietly, very completely, turning itself over to someone else. He just didn't know yet how little he was going to be able to do about it. The first legal notice arrived at Vincent Curo's house in Bay Ridge at 7:15 the following morning. Vincent was at the kitchen table when his wife brought it in. A standard envelope, courier delivered, addressed to him personally with a return address he didn't recognize. His wife set it down beside his coffee and left the room with the particular learned instinct of a woman who'd spent 22 years married to a man in Vincent Curo's line of work. You put the thing down and you leave the room, and you don't ask about the envelope. Vincent opened it, read it, read it again. It was a formal notice of succession claim under the Moretti Syndicate's founding agreement, acknowledging Vincent Curo as a capo of record under the organization's operational structure and informing him that the majority voting authority over the syndicate's leadership succession had been formally invoked by the rightful bloodline holder. The notice listed the applicable provisions, cited the founding document with specific section numbers, and was signed at the bottom by an attorney whose firm Vincent had never heard of and by a notary whose seal was stamped cleanly in the lower right corner. Attached was a single page, a summary of the cause provisions, the specific violations being cited, the financial diversions, the agreement breaches, all of it itemized with dates and amounts and cross-references to supporting documentation available upon request. Vincent Curo sat at his kitchen table in Bay Ridge and drank his coffee and looked at the ceiling for a while. He'd been with the Moretti organization for 23 years. He'd served under Carmine for 14 of those, and under Dante for 9. He was not a man who gave his loyalty cheaply or withdrew it quickly. That had been his professional identity for 2 decades, the bedrock thing about him that made him valuable. He'd stayed through commission fights and federal pressure, and 2 internal reorganizations that had cost other capos their positions, because he was the kind of man who stayed. He looked at the numbers on the cause provision summary, the specific amounts, the specific dates. He knew some of those dates. He knew what had been happening on those dates because he'd asked about it at the time and gotten answers that hadn't sat right, and he'd made the decision that men in his position make. The decision to accept the answer and move on, because the alternative was a confrontation he wasn't certain he wanted the consequences of. He'd made that decision 4 times over 9 years. He was looking at those 4 decisions on a piece of paper now, with amounts attached. He folded the notice carefully, put it in his breast pocket, finished his coffee. Then he picked up his phone and called a number that was not Dante Moretti's. Eat it. By noon, 11 capos across the Moretti Syndicate's operational territory had received similar notices. By 2 in the afternoon, the Moretti organization's primary financial network, the series of accounts and holding structures that managed the flow of money from the syndicate's operational income through its layers of legitimate business fronts, had been formally flagged under a legal instrument that Luca Romano had spent 4 months constructing with an attorney who specialized in the specific and arcane area of organized crime organizational law, a niche so narrow and strange that there were perhaps 6 practitioners in the country who genuinely understood it. The flagging didn't freeze the accounts. It couldn't freeze them. That would require federal action, and federal action was not what Vivian was building toward, at least not yet. What it did was place a formal record of contested succession authority over every transaction that moved through the network, which meant that anyone who processed a transfer, anyone who signed off on a disbursement, anyone who moved money through those structures was now doing so in the context of a documented succession dispute. The organization's financial liaison in Chicago, a man named Petrov, who had managed the Midwest flow for 6 years and who was not technically a member of any family but operated under arrangements with three of them, received a call from his attorney at 2:30 informing him of the flag. He then made 3 calls of his own, none of which were to Dante Moretti. By 4 o'clock, 2 of the 4 banks that processed the Moretti syndicate's legitimate front revenue had quietly placed holds on pending transfers pending legal clarification. Dante found out about the financial flag at 3 in the afternoon from his personal accountant, who called him in a voice that had the particular compressed quality of a man delivering news he has been dreading delivering. "How long have you known about this?" Dante said. "I got the notification an hour ago." "That's not what I asked you." A pause. "I had some early indications last week that something might be in motion. I didn't have specifics." "And you didn't tell me." The silence on the other end of the line was its own answer. Dante ended the call. He sat in the East Wing study. He'd barely left it since the previous evening, and looked at the wall across from him and breathed through his nose the way he did when what he was feeling needed to be managed before it became a decision. His accountant had known something was in motion and hadn't told him. His capos weren't answering. Marco Iannetti still hadn't returned a call. The financial network was flagged. His personal attorney had a conflict of interest he wouldn't disclose. He picked up his phone and called the one person he was absolutely certain would answer. Carla Voss picked up on the 3rd ring. "I need to talk to you," he said. A beat of silence, just long enough. "Dante? Don't." His voice came out harder than he intended, and he didn't walk it back. "I need to talk to you in person. Tonight." Another beat. Longer. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," she said. He felt something move in his chest. Not surprise, not quite, but the specific sensation of a thing confirming itself that you'd been telling yourself wasn't happening. "What does that mean?" "It means things are complicated right now, and I think we should give it some space until what?" Not a question. A wall. "Until things settle," she said. Her voice was careful, measured. He recognized the texture of it. It was the voice she used in professional settings when she was managing a situation. It was not a voice that had anything personal in it. "You got something," he said. "Somebody sent you something." Silence. "Carla, I think you should focus on your situation right now," she said. "I think that's what matters." "My situation." He heard his own voice go flat. "You were in my house 2 days ago." "I know." "You were—" He stopped, started again, lower. "2 days ago." "I know, Dante." And for just a moment, something human moved through her voice. Not guilt exactly, not apology, but the specific register of a person who is doing something they've decided to do and is not entirely comfortable with the texture of doing it. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then the professional layer came back. "I'm sorry. I really am. But I have to think about my position here." "Your position," he said. "Yes." He held the phone for a moment. Then he said, "You understand who I am." "I understand who you were," she said. And then quietly, with a kind of terrible gentleness, "I'm not sure that's the same thing right now." She ended the call. Dante sat in the East Wing study and looked at the phone in his hand. He sat that way for almost 4 minutes. He was breathing. He was aware of breathing, of the specific mechanical effort of it, the way the chest moves when the rest of the body has gone very still. He was aware of the room around him, the books on the shelves that he'd accumulated over the years, many of which he hadn't read. The desk his father had used, which he'd kept because getting rid of it would have required a decision he hadn't wanted to make. The window that looked out onto the East Garden, where the October afternoon was going gray and cold and honest. He thought about Carmine Moretti. He thought about his father's voice on the phone the morning after he'd brought Vivian to dinner. "She's the smartest person in any room she walks into." He thought about how he'd heard that and thought, "Yes, and she's with me." He put the phone face down on the desk. Then he stood up, walked to the small bar cart in the corner of the study, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't usually drink before evening, and drank half of it standing there. He set the glass down, looked at the remaining whiskey, left it. He needed to think, not feel. Think. He needed someone who would sit across from him and think with him, and he was understanding, with a specificity that was almost clinical in how it arrived, that the number of people available for that function had become, very recently, very small. Done. He reached Tommy Krell at 6 in the evening. Tommy Krell was not a capo. He was not in the organizational hierarchy in any formal sense. He'd been Dante's driver for 6 years, and before that a street earner in the Moretti crew in Red Hook, and he was loyal in the uncomplicated way of men who don't have the strategic intelligence to be disloyal. Not stupid, but operating at a register that didn't include long-game calculation. He did what he was told. He showed up. He'd taken a charge once, in the early years, that could have gone very badly for him and hadn't, and he attributed that to Dante. And that attribution had calcified into a simple, durable thing. "I need you to drive," Dante said. "Yeah. Where?" "I don't know yet. I just need to move." Tommy was at the estate in 30 minutes. Dante got in the back without a word and they drove. Out of the gate, through the neighborhood, onto the highway heading south. No destination, just motion. Dante sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the road going past and thought. "You hear anything?" he said after 20 minutes of silence. Tommy's eyes moved to the rearview mirror briefly. "Some things." "Like what?" "People talking, not to me directly, but around me." "What are they saying?" Tommy was quiet for a moment in the way of a man choosing words with more care than he usually needed. "They're saying that there's paperwork, legal stuff, that the commission's going to look at it. And people are waiting to see what the commission does before they do anything." A pause. "That's what I hear." Dante looked at the road. "Who's doing the talking?" "It's not one person. It's like everybody already knows something, and they're just they're not talking about it directly, but it's there." "How long have they known?" Tommy's hands moved slightly on the wheel, a shift. "I think," he said carefully, "a while." Dante looked at the back of Tommy's head, at the specific set of his shoulders. "You knew something." "I didn't know anything specific. Tommy, I heard some things 3-4 months ago. I didn't know what they meant." "What did you hear?" "That there was a woman who'd been talking to some people, that she'd been meeting with people in Boston, Chicago. I didn't—" He stopped, swallowed. "I didn't connect it to anything." Dante was quiet for a long time. The highway moved under the car. The lights of other vehicles passed and fell behind. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. His voice was completely level. That specific flatness that people who'd worked around Dante Moretti long enough recognized as more dangerous than volume. "Because I didn't know it was real," Tommy said. "I thought it was just talk. I didn't want to bring you something that turned out to be nothing." "You thought that, on your own?" "Yeah." "You made that decision on your own?" Tommy's jaw moved. "Yeah." Dante nodded once, looked back out the window. "Take me home," he said. Gimant. Marco Iannetti finally came to the estate at 8:45 that evening. He hadn't been summoned. He came on his own, which told Dante something, and he came alone, which told Dante something else. He was shown into the East Wing study by Agnes, who was still there. Agnes was always there, Dante realized. She was part of the structure of the house in a way that he'd never thought about. And he wondered now, with a fresh and unpleasant attention, exactly what Agnes had seen over the years and who, if anyone, she'd told. Marco sat in the chair across from the desk. He was a compact man in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent calm through long practice. It wasn't that he didn't feel things. It was that he'd learned very early that a face that shows things is a liability, and he'd trained his accordingly. He sat with his jacket buttoned and his hands folded in his lap, and he looked at Dante with the expression of a man who has decided what he's going to say and is waiting for the right moment to say it. Dante looked at him across the desk. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You didn't take my calls," Dante said. "No." "For 2 days." "Yes." Why? Marco unfolded his hands, refolded them. Because I needed to understand the situation before I talked to you, and I couldn't understand it clearly while I was also managing your expectations. Managing my expectations. Dante's voice was very quiet. You've been my consigliere for 9 years. I know. 9 years. I know, Dante. And you needed 2 days to figure out whether to take my call. Marco met his eyes. What I needed, he said, with the care of a man measuring every word, was 2 days to figure out what I was going to tell you when I did. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Ordinary sound. The sound of a house going on. Tell me now, Dante said. Marco took a breath. Let it out. The documents are real. The succession provision is legally sound. I had it looked at by 2 people independently, neither of them in your network, and they both said the same thing. The cause documentation is extensive. I've seen partial summaries, and what I've seen is going to hold up. It can be challenged. It can be disputed. That's not the same thing. Marco shifted slightly in the chair. Challenging it means going to the commission with a counter-argument, and the commission right now is— He paused, chose his word. The commission is paying very close attention. The commission will hear me. They'll hear you, Marco said. I'm not saying they won't, but Dante— And something changed in his voice then, just slightly, a degree of temperature dropping out of it. When's the last time you were in the same room as Sal Ferrero or Gino Marchetti? When's the last time you sat down with either of the Boston families for something that wasn't transactional? Dante didn't answer. She's been in those rooms, Marco said. She's been in rooms with people across every affiliated family for— I'm told it's been about 14 months. Maybe longer. The silence had a specific texture now. Dante felt it on his skin. You knew, he said. The flatness again. Worse than the quiet. I didn't know specifically. Marco. The older man looked at him steadily. I had indications. I didn't follow them because— He stopped. Why? Marco's jaw moved, and for just a moment, behind the trained, calm face, something else appeared. Something that looked close to what a person looks like when they've been carrying something for a long time and have finally put it down in the wrong place. Because I told myself it wasn't my business, he said. What happened between you and Vivian wasn't my business. And by the time I understood it was larger than that, I had to decide where I stood. The words landed, and Dante understood exactly what they meant and felt the specific weight of understanding it land somewhere in his sternum, something with physical mass. And where do you stand? He said. Marco looked at him for a long moment. His face was very still. His hands were folded in his lap. The lamp on the corner of the desk threw warm light across the side of his face, and the window behind Dante showed the dark garden, and the house was very quiet. I think, Marco said slowly, that there are things that need to be made right. And I think Vivian is positioned to make them right in a way that's good for the organization, and I think— He paused one more time. I think Carmine would have seen this coming. The name hung in the room. Dante looked at his consigliere of 9 years. Get out of my house, he said. Marco stood. He buttoned the bottom button of his jacket. A small, habitual gesture, the kind of automatic motion that belongs to a man's body independent of whatever's happening around it. He walked to the door of the study. Stopped. She's not destroying you, he said, without turning around. She's just correcting a mistake. You understand the difference. Somewhere, you understand the difference. He left. The house was very quiet. Dante sat at his father's desk in his father's study in his father's house. And outside the dark garden sat still and cold under the October sky. And the empire that bore his name was 2 days into the process of deciding it didn't need his name anymore. And what he felt, sitting there in that quiet, was the specific airless sensation of a man who has just watched every exit close simultaneously. He sat there until after midnight. He didn't drink the rest of the whiskey. He didn't make calls. He sat with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has run out of immediate moves and knows it. And he let the night go on around him, and somewhere around 1 a.m, he understood what he was going to do next. He was going to fight. Not because he believed he could win, not yet, not with that clarity, but because fighting was the only register he knew, the only language his body trusted, and because somewhere under the shock and the quiet and the weight of Marco's last words was something older and harder. The refusal, cellular and total, to be the man who sat in his father's chair and accepted the verdict of a woman who had packed her bags while he was laughing down the hall. He was going to find the thing that broke her case. There was always something. There was always a thread. He just had to find it before Thursday. He called Gerald Doyle at 7 the next morning. Gerald Doyle was not an attorney in any conventional sense. He was 64 years old, had been disbarred in 2 states, and currently operated as what could most charitably be described as a legal researcher, a man who knew where documents lived, who understood the specific archaeology of organizational agreements and succession law and the Commission's historical precedents, and who had, over 40 years, built a practice out of finding the threads that other people hadn't found or had decided to ignore. Dante had used him twice before. Both times the work had been specific, quiet, and effective. Doyle was expensive and unsentimental and had no personal loyalty to anyone. His professional identity was entirely transactional, which was exactly what Dante needed right now. "I need everything," Dante said. "The Sordello bloodline, the founding agreement, the 1977 succession provision, and anything that came after it. I need to know if there's a defect." "What kind of defect are you looking for?" Doyle's voice was dry and unhurried, the voice of a man who has heard urgency so many times it no longer registers as a weather condition. "Any kind. Legal standing, procedural error in the notarization, a challenge to the bloodline documentation, anything that puts the provision in question." "Timeline?" "I need something by Wednesday night." A pause. "That's 36 hours. "I know what it is." "It'll cost you double for the speed." "Fine. And I need access to the original document, not a copy." Dante thought about this. The original document was in the possession of the attorney who had notarized it 9 years ago. He'd spent part of the previous night trying to identify who that was, working from the name on the photocopy in the envelope, and had found a firm in Philadelphia that had dissolved 8 years ago, its files transferred to a successor practice, address, and current status unclear. "I'm working on getting access to the original," he said. "In the meantime, work from the photocopy I can send you." "Photocopies have limitations." "Work with what I can give you and tell me what you find." He sent the photocopy within the hour. Then he called Tommy Krell, because Tommy Krell was what he had left in terms of people he could put in motion without wondering what they were reporting back and to whom. And he gave Tommy a task that required driving to Philadelphia and finding the physical location of a law firm's successor practice and reporting back before noon. Tommy called back at 11:47. The successor practice existed. It was a small general practice firm in Chestnut Hill. The original files from the dissolved firm were archived on site. Whether the Moretti documents were among them was something Tommy had not been able to confirm without going inside, which he had not done. "Go inside," Dante said. "How?" "I don't care how." A pause. "Okay," Tommy said. "Chids." The commission meeting in Boston happened Thursday morning, and Dante was not invited. He knew it was happening because he had one remaining contact in the commission's administrative structure, a man named Ferretti who handled logistics for the New England families and who had, over the years, been compensated for the occasional courtesy of advanced scheduling information. Ferretti called him at 8:15 Thursday morning, and his voice had the quality of a man making what he understood to be a final professional transaction. "It's at the estate in Weston," Ferretti said. 10 o'clock. Sal Ferrero is hosting. All 5 families have representation. And Vivian. She arrived last night. She's staying at the Ferrero property." Dante sat with that for a moment. She'd been invited to stay at Sal Ferrero's property. Sal Ferrero, who had known Carmine Moretti for 40 years, who had attended Dante's father's funeral and stood at the grave with his hat in both hands, who had called Dante after Carmine died and told him he had the commission's full confidence. "Who else is there?" Dante said. "Romano, and an attorney I don't know. And," Ferretti paused, "Marco Ianetti." The specific sensation again, the ground shift, low and structural. "Marco is there," He arrived with Romano last night. Dante ended the call. He stood in the kitchen of the estate. He'd come downstairs for the first time since Marco left, drawn by hunger or by the need to be somewhere other than the study. And he stood at the counter with the phone in his hand, and he breathed through the information the way you breathe through something with physical mass pressing against your chest. Marco had gone to Boston. Marco, his consigliere of 9 years, had driven to Boston and arrived the night before the commission meeting and was sleeping under Sal Ferrero's roof and would sit across a table this morning, and whatever he said in that room, it would not be said in Dante's interest. He thought about the photograph on Marco's bookshelf, the one Marco had apparently laid face down. He thought about what that gesture meant, a man putting down a version of the past that no longer served him, quiet and private and already decided before anyone knew it was happening. He thought about the photograph of himself and Carmine in his own study. He looked at it every day. He hadn't laid it face down. He hadn't been able to make himself do that, and he understood now that this too was information, that his inability to put his father away was the same failure that had left him here, in this kitchen, finding out about his own commission meeting through a logistics man he paid for scraps of scheduling information. He went back upstairs. He was going to hear from Doyle today. Doyle was going to find something. Doyle called at 2 in the afternoon. "I've been through everything you sent me," he said, twice. Dante was at the desk. He had a legal pad in front of him that he'd been making notes on. Not organized notes, just the movement of a mind trying to find a shape in a problem. The pad was dense with his handwriting, arrows and cross-references, and words circled and crossed out. "What did you find?" Dante said. "Nothing," Doyle said. The word landed in a specific way. Not the way words land when they're said carelessly, the way they land when they're being said precisely, by someone who means exactly that word and not a softer version of it. "That's not possible," Dante said. "I've looked at the provision from 6 angles. The notarization is clean. I found the notary. She practiced in Pennsylvania. Her license was active and in good standing in the year the document was executed. She has no relationship to any party in this dispute that I can establish. The bloodline documentation that supports Vivian's succession claim runs through the Sordello lineage as established in the founding agreement. The cause provisions are clearly enumerated, and the documentation of cause I've seen in the summary is a pause. It's thorough. If the supporting evidence is as complete as the summary suggests, the cause claim is solid. There has to be a defect somewhere. The original wasn't formally registered with the commission in the year it was executed. I checked. You're right that it wasn't formally registered, but the founding agreement doesn't require registration for validity. The provision is self-executing once the bloodline holder formally invokes it and presents the cause documentation. Registration is for the commission's records. It's procedural, not jurisdictional. That argument won't hold. Dante was very still. The bloodline claim itself. Test the bloodline claim. I'd need genetic documentation to challenge it, and more importantly, I'd need the commission to agree to accept a genetic challenge, which would require them to first be skeptical of the existing documentation, which, from everything I can see, is going to be... Doyle stopped. "Dante, I've been doing this for 40 years. I know what a solid document looks like, and I know what a weak one looks like. This is solid. Whoever put this together had a very clear objective and built toward it very carefully. There are no gaps. There are no loose threads." "There are always loose threads." "Not in this one," Doyle said. "I'm sorry." The line was quiet for a moment. "I'll pay you double what we agreed," Dante said. "Keep looking." "I'll keep looking," Doyle said. "But I want you to hear what I'm telling you, because I think you need to hear it. The challenge you're looking for doesn't exist in the document. If there's a challenge available to you, it's not a legal one." The line went dead. Dante set the phone on the desk. He looked at the legal pad in front of him, at the dense handwriting, at the architecture of a mind trying to fight its way out of a room that had no doors. Not a legal challenge. He turned the legal pad over so he couldn't see the writing. He sat for a moment with the blank back surface in front of him. Then he picked up a pen and wrote 4 words. "What does she need?" He stared at them. Not as a question about strategy, as a question about architecture, about what the whole construction depended on, what the central weight-bearing element was. what you'd have to remove to bring it down. She needed the commission to recognize her claim. That was happening today in Boston. She needed the cause documentation to hold. Doyle said it would. She needed the bloodline claim to be accepted. The documents supported it. She needed, he thought about this, pen hovering, the organization's people to transfer their loyalty. That was already happening. He looked at the 4 words. Then he underlined bloodline and looked at that for a while. The Sordello lineage. Vivian's connection to it ran through the founding agreement's provision that Carmine had added, the provision that designated her as the bloodline holder's successor in succession authority. Not by birth. By formal designation, Carmine's designation. He looked at this for a long time. Then he wrote 2 more words. Why her? Because Carmine had chosen her. That was the hinge. That was the thing the entire structure rotated around. Carmine Moretti, in the last year of his life, had gone around his own son and put the succession authority in his daughter-in-law's hands. Why? He'd asked himself this question the first night, and then the shock of everything else had buried it. He came back to it now and sat with it properly, with the full attention it deserved, and he thought about what he knew about Carmine in the final year, about who Carmine had been talking to, about the things his father had said in those last months that Dante had, in the way of sons who do not want to hear certain things, mostly not listened to. Carmine had said, in the autumn before he died, sitting in this study, in this chair, at this desk, "You don't see what's in front of you. You never have. You look at what you want and you miss what's there." Dante had thought he was talking about business. He thought about what the provision required to be valid. Carmine's signature, the notarization, the witnesses. 2 witnesses, both deceased. He thought about witnesses, about the specific vulnerability of a document that rested on the testimony of people who were no longer available. He wrote, witnesses. Then he sat with the word. Tommy Krell called at 4:30. "I got into the files," he said. He sounded winded, like he'd been moving fast. "And? There's a file, the firm's name is on it." A pause, the sound of paper. "It's a thick one. There's a lot in here." "The original document, is it there?" "There's a lot of papers. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what I'm looking at." "Is there a document with Carmine Moretti's signature?" Rustling. Silence. More rustling. Yeah, there's something signed by Carmine Moretti, and there's a notary seal." A pause. "And there's a witness page, 2 signatures." Dante gripped the phone. "Read me the names." Tommy read slowly, clearly sounding out what he was seeing. First one says, "Okay, Joseph A. Caruso." Second one says, a pause, "R. Delmar Hatch." Dante wrote both names. "Photograph every page, every single page. Send them to me encrypted. Don't touch anything else in the file. Put everything back exactly where you found it and leave." "Okay. Yeah, give me 10 minutes. Dante set the phone on the desk and looked at the 2 names he'd written. Joseph A. Caruso, R. Delmar Hatch. 2 men who had been present in a room 9 years ago when Carmine Moretti signed a document that had just dismantled everything Dante had believed was his, both reportedly deceased. Doyle had mentioned that, had said 2 witnesses, both deceased with the tone of a man noting a closed door. But deceased was a word that required verification. Deceased was a word that had, in Dante's experience, occasionally been applied to people who were not deceased, but who had reasons to appear that way. He looked at the names. R. Delmar Hatch was unusual enough that it could be searched specifically. He typed it into the phone and got nothing immediate. He called a contact he used for records work, not someone in the organization, someone peripheral, someone who moved in the world of documentation and identity research, and gave him both names and asked for death records, specifically for the time period following the document's execution. The records man called back in 50 minutes. "Joseph Caruso died 4 years ago," he said. "Cardiac event. Death certificate filed in Pennsylvania. Interment in—" "The other one," Dante said. A pause. "I'm not finding a death record for an R. Delmar Hatch in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut. I'm not finding one in any state in the database I'm working from." Dante looked at the name on his legal pad. He's alive. I can't confirm he's alive. I can confirm I'm not finding a death record. Find him, Dante said. Whatever it takes. I need a location by morning. He ended the call. Tommy's photographs arrived 20 minutes later. 37 images, the pages of the file, showing the original document in its complete form. Dante went through every page slowly. Then he sent them to Doyle with a message. Witness 2, R. Delmar Hatch. No death record. Look at the witness attestation clause. Tell me if his signature is challengeable, if he's alive and can be compelled to testify. Doyle responded in 11 minutes. If he's alive and willing to recant or challenge his attestation, it opens the document to contest. That's a thread. Don't pull it until you know what it's attached to. Dante read this twice. Then he set the phone down and looked out the study window at the black October garden and felt, for the first time in 3 days, something that wasn't structural freefall. He felt a way through. Ugh. The commission meeting in Boston ended at 2:15 in the afternoon. Vivienne was standing at the window of the room she'd been given at the Ferrero estate, looking out at the grounds. Large, well-maintained, the kind of property that exists entirely outside of time, that belongs to a world with such deep roots it doesn't need to announce itself. When Luca knocked and came in. She read him before he spoke. She'd been reading Luca Romano for 14 months, and she knew his face well enough to know the difference between his controlled good news expression and his actual face, and what he was wearing now was a version of the second. Tell me, she said. They recognized the claim. He sat in the chair near the window. He was carrying a leather folder he'd had with him all morning. Unanimously, all 5 representatives voted to acknowledge the succession authority. She nodded. She felt the acknowledgement move through her, not euphoria, not relief. Something quieter and more structural. The sensation of a thing she'd built holding its weight. Marco? She said. Marco spoke on the record in support of the provision's validity. He was clear about it. Luca paused. He also provided documentation of the asset diversion that we hadn't seen. He had his own records. She looked at him. He had records. 9 years of them. Apparently he'd been keeping a parallel accounting. A small pause. He said he kept them because he wanted to be able to answer for what happened in the organization if anyone ever asked. He said he never thought he'd use them. She turned back to the window. Marco Iannetti had kept 9 years of parallel records. Had carried them alongside his loyalty to a man who didn't deserve it, carrying them the way you carry something you hope you'll never need and know you might, and had walked into a commission meeting in Boston and put them on the table. She thought about Carmine Moretti, about the autumn dinner where she'd first understood what kind of man he was, not by anything dramatic, but by the way he'd asked her a question about the organization's structure and then listened to her answer with the total attention of someone who was actually hearing what she said. She'd been 28. She'd been 3 months married to his son. He'd listened to her for 11 minutes about something she wasn't supposed to know anything about, and at the end he'd nodded once and looked at her with those dark, deliberate eyes and said, "Good. Now don't tell Dante you know this." She'd understood then that Carmine saw her, and she'd understood in the same moment that he was warning her about his son. She just hadn't known yet what the warning was for. 6 years later, sitting in this same room at his bedside in the last weeks of his life, he'd been the one who brought up the provision, who told her about it quietly, with her hand in his, speaking in the careful, measured way of a man who understood he was speaking to the future. He hadn't asked her if she wanted it. He told her it was already done. He told her why. And then he'd said, in almost the last serious conversation they'd ever have, "You'll know when. Don't be in a hurry and don't be afraid of it." She'd spent 6 years not being in a hurry. "What's next?" Luca said. She turned from the window. "We go home," she said, "and we start the restructure." Luca nodded. He stood, tucked the leather folder under his arm. Then at the door, he stopped. "He's going to try something," he said. "He's not done." "I know. The document is solid, but if he finds—" "I know, Luca." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "I've been worried for 2 years. I'm done with that too." She looked at him evenly. "Let him look. He'll find what I left for him to find." Luca Romano stared at her. Very still. the specific stillness of a careful man encountering something he hadn't anticipated. "You left something." "I left exactly what I needed him to find," she said, "and exactly what I needed him to do with it." She put on her coat. "Call Romano's car. I want to be back in New York by 7. She walked past him into the hall, and behind her, Luca Romano stood in the doorway of the room for a moment, looking at the space she'd just vacated, understanding, not for the first time, but with a new and specific depth, that he had been, for 14 months, working alongside something that operated on a level he was only now beginning to fully see. The records man found R. Delmar Hatch at 6:15 in the morning. He was alive. He was 71 years old. He was living in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona, under his own name, without apparent concealment. He had a phone number listed in the community's resident directory. Dante had the information in his hands at 6:20. He sat with it, looked at the name and the address and the phone number, felt the thread in his grip, taut and real, the first real thing he'd had in 4 days. He thought about what Doyle had said. "Don't pull it until you know what it's attached to." He called Doyle. "He's in Scottsdale," Dante said. "Alive. 71. No apparent concealment." Doyle was quiet for a moment. "That's interesting." "Why interesting?" "Because if you were a witness to a document that was this sensitive and you had any reason to fear consequences, you'd conceal yourself. You wouldn't be living under your own name in a retirement community with a listed phone number." A long pause. "That's either a man who doesn't know his signature matters, or it's a man who knows exactly what he is and isn't afraid of it." Dante thought about this. Why wouldn't he be afraid? Doyle said nothing for a moment. Then, "Dante, I told you not to pull the thread until you know what it's attached to. I meant it. There's something about this I don't like." "What don't you like?" "The fact that he's findable. The fact that he's there, in plain sight, reachable. Someone built this document very carefully over a very long time. They didn't leave loose ends. A living, findable witness isn't a loose end." Dante looked at the address in Scottsdale, at the phone number in the resident directory. "It's a door," he said slowly. "Or," Doyle said, "it's a door that someone left open because they wanted you to walk through it." The silence between them had a specific texture. Outside, the estate was dark and still. Dante's hand was flat on the desk. He could feel his own pulse in his palm. "She knows I'd look for the witnesses," he said. "Not a question." "She apparently knows a great deal," Doyle said carefully. "About how you think, about what you do when you're cornered, about the moves that would occur to a man like you in a situation like this." A pause. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Is there anything about that witness, his name, his background, his relationship to your father, that could be used against you? Anything that, if it came out in a commission context, would do damage to your position rather than hers?" Dante stared at the name. R. Delmar Hatch, 71 years old, Scottsdale, Arizona. He thought about what he knew of the men his father had trusted in that final year. The names, the relationships, the things that had been adjacent to Carmine in those last months that Dante had not paid close enough attention to because he had been focused on other things. And then, slowly, with the cold specificity of a thing surfacing from deep water, he thought of something. He thought of a name connected to R. Delmar Hatch that he had heard once, peripherally, years ago, in a context he hadn't examined because at the time it hadn't seemed relevant. He thought of what that name meant, what it connected to, what it would look like in a commission hearing room if Dante Moretti produced R. Delmar Hatch as a witness to challenge his father's document. And R. Delmar Hatch instead spoke about things that connected Dante, directly and irrefutably, to a financial arrangement that predated even the offenses listed in the cause documentation. An arrangement that Dante had believed was buried, an arrangement that could not simply be characterized as asset diversion or breach of agreement, an arrangement that could only be characterized as betrayal of the organization at a fundamental level, the kind of thing that didn't result in succession disputes, the kind of thing that resulted in a man ceasing to be a problem entirely. Dante sat at his father's desk at 6:40 in the morning and felt the thread in his hand, and he understood, with the completeness of a realization that arrives all at once rather than in pieces, that the thread wasn't loose. It was a wire. She hadn't left our Delmar Hatch findable by accident. She hadn't left a living witness sitting in a retirement community in Scottsdale because she'd made an error. She'd left him there the way you leave a door open in a burning building, because she wanted Dante to walk through it, wanted him to pull the thread and call the witness and bring that witness before the commission, at which point R. Delmar Hatch would not recant his signature on Carmine's document. He would testify to something else entirely. Dante put the phone down on the desk. He looked at the legal pad with its notes and circled words and the two names he'd written as though they were a lifeline. He looked at R. Delmar Hatch's name specifically, at the letters of it, at the simple ordinary structure of a name that had been sitting in a retirement community directory like a trap with the mechanism exposed, waiting for exactly the man who would come looking for it. He felt the specific sensation of a floor that wasn't there. She'd been 3 moves ahead. Not 1 move. Not 2. 3 moves ahead. She'd anticipated not just what he'd do, but how he'd feel doing it. How the discovery of a living witness would land in the chest of a desperate man. What he'd do with the feeling. How fast he'd move. And she'd built the counter to that move into the original construction 9 years before he'd needed it. Understanding precisely the psychology of the man who would one day be sitting where Dante was sitting now. He sat very still for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Doyle back. "Don't touch Hatch," he said. "Don't make contact. Don't go near him." "Understood," Doyle said. And then, quietly, "I'm sorry." Dante ended the call. He sat at his father's desk as the morning came in through the study windows, thin and gray and without warmth, and he understood that the war he'd been planning to fight did not exist. There was no battle. There was no thread. There was only a woman who had spent 6 years understanding him more completely than he had ever bothered to understand her, and who had built, around every move he might make, a structure so complete that the act of fighting it was itself the mechanism of his destruction. He had one option left. He picked up the phone one more time, and he called a number he had not called in 9 years. A number he'd kept because his father had told him to keep it, the way his father had told him to keep certain things he didn't understand the purpose of yet. The number for Sal Ferrero's private line. It rang 3 times. "Dante," Sal said. His voice was not unkind. That was almost worse. "I need a meeting," Dante said. "Full commission, in person. I need to be in the room." A long pause. "What are you bringing to the table?" Dante looked at the gray morning through the study window, at the garden going colorless and cold, at the estate that had been his father's and his father's father's, that had his name on the deed and his family's history in every room, that had for 9 years been the seat of his empire and was now, he understood, with the finality of something that has finished happening, simply a house. "A surrender," he said, "with conditions." The silence on Sal Ferrero's end lasted 4 full seconds. "I'll make some calls," Sal said. "Give me until noon." The meeting was set for Saturday, not at the Ferrero estate in Boston. Neutral ground, a private dining room in a members-only club in Midtown Manhattan that 3 of the 5 families had historical relationships with, a room that had hosted commission discussions going back 40 years, whose walls understood discretion in the way that old rooms do. Dante spent Friday in the estate, mostly in the study, with the legal pad in front of him and the photographs from the Philadelphia file and Doyle's notes, not looking for a thread anymore, doing something different, building his position for Saturday, understanding what he had to offer that Vivian needed and what he needed in return and where those 2 calculations might produce something survivable. He did not sleep Friday night. He lay in the bedroom that still had Vivian's furniture, her reading lamp, the books she'd left because they weren't the ones she'd wanted, arranged on the nightstand in the particular order that had been their arrangement for 14 years. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about Saturday and what Saturday required him to be. Not what he was, what Saturday required. He understood that those were different things and that the distance between them was the most important distance he'd ever had to cross. He got up at 4, made coffee the way Vivian had made it the morning she left. Standing at the kitchen counter, himself, no staff. He drank it at the window looking at the rear garden in the dark, and he thought about his father, and he thought about the 11 words Carmine had said on the phone the morning after Vivian came to dinner. Words that Dante had spent 14 years not understanding the full weight of. She's the smartest person in any room she walks into. Make sure you understand what that means before you do anything stupid. He'd done stupid things. He'd done them casually and consistently and with the confidence of a man who believed the room rearranged itself around him by nature rather than by effort. He drank his coffee. He looked at the dark garden. He made himself stay with the full shape of that, the full catalog of it, the full accounting, without the defensive architecture that usually came up fast when a man starts looking at his own failures, without the rationalizations and the reframings and the narratives about circumstances and pressure and what people in his position did. Just the clean inventory of what he'd done and what it had cost. It took about an hour. When he was done, he rinsed his cup and went upstairs to put on the suit he'd set out the night before, and he was ready for Saturday, in the only sense that mattered. Vivian arrived at the club at 9:45. She came with Luca Romano and Marco Ianetti, which was its own statement, the consigliere arriving with the new administration, walking through the entrance of a commission meeting space beside the woman who now held the succession authority that had once been managed by the man they were about to sit across from. Marco's face was composed in the way it always was, the trained neutrality of decades, but something in his posture had changed since Dante's study 2 nights ago. A loosening, almost. The specific physical quality of a man who has set something down. The room was already occupied when they arrived. Sal Ferrero sat at the head of the long table. 73 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had been in rooms like this one for 50 years and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them. To his left, the representative from the Chicago families, a man named Colucci, 50s, careful eyes. To his right, the Boston representative. At the far end of the table, the 2 New Jersey family representatives sitting adjacent to each other in the manner of men who have long since decided to present a unified front in mixed company. And Dante. He was already seated when Vivian came in. He was at the near end of the table, directly opposite Sal Ferrero's position, in a chair that was not the head of anything. He was wearing a dark suit and his face was composed, and he looked, Vivian thought as she took her seat, like a man who had decided something. Not a man performing composure. A man who had actually arrived somewhere. She looked at him for 3 seconds. He met her eyes. Neither of them spoke. Sal Ferrero set his hands flat on the table. We're here because Dante Moretti requested this meeting. The Commission has already formally recognized Vivian Ashcroft's succession authority under the founding provision. That recognition stands regardless of what's said today. We're here to hear what Dante has to say. That's the frame. He looked at Dante. Go ahead. Dante looked at the table for a moment, not at the people around it, at the table's surface, the dark wood of it, its age. Then he looked up. I'm not here to challenge the recognition, he said. His voice was steady and without the particular performative weight it usually carried in rooms like this. The authority texture he had learned to deploy since his 20s, the presence of a man reminding a room who he was. That was gone. What was left was something that sounded, to the people around the table who had known him long enough to notice, like the stripped-down voice of a man speaking without a net. The provision is valid. The cause documentation is extensive, and it's accurate. I'm not disputing it. The room was very quiet. What I'm here to ask, he said, is for conditions on my exit. He looked at Sal. I'm surrendering operational control of the Moretti Syndicate. I'm signing whatever the Commission requires. I'm asking for 3 things in return. Sal nodded once. Say them. The estate stays in my name. It's personal property, not organizational. It was my father's house and his father's house. I'm asking for it to stay mine. He said this without drama, without the emotional weight that could have been applied to it. Just a request, laid flat. Sal looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Dante. That's already the case, she said. Her voice was even. The estate was never part of the succession claim. It's personal property. Dante absorbed this without visible reaction. He hadn't known. He'd assumed it was on the table. She'd never put it on the table. He nodded once. Second, he said, the people who stayed with me through this, Tommy Krell, a few others at the ground level, I want assurances they're not carrying consequences for loyalty to me. Sal looked at Vivian again. This was a different kind of request, and the room understood that. Not about Dante, about the people around him, about what his exit meant for people who hadn't had the sophistication to read the room earlier and redirect. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She looked at Marco briefly, then back at Dante. Provided they're not carrying independent liabilities I'm not aware of, she said. Ground-level loyalty isn't something I'm interested in punishing. Dante nodded. Third. He paused here. Not for effect. It was a real pause. The pause of a man arriving at the thing that actually costs something. I want to be able to leave. Not the city, not the country. Just, I want to not be watched. I want the organization to not follow what I do with the rest of my life, as long as I'm not doing anything that touches the organization. This was the one that mattered. This was the ask that could not be dressed in the language of business or fairness or precedent. This was a man asking for the right to disappear into an ordinary life, to step out of the world they all inhabited and not be tracked through it. The silence this time was longer. Sal Ferrero looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Dante, not at the table, not at the room, at him. The specific person, the man she'd been married to for 14 years, whose face she knew in every register, whose voice she'd learned to read the way you learn the weather patterns of a place you live in for a long time. She looked at him for what felt to everyone in the room like a long time, but was probably 8 seconds. Yes, she said. Those 3 conditions are accepted. Dante looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked at the table. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, a formal statement of resignation from operational control of the Moretti Syndicate, prepared by Gerald Doyle, who had turned out to be useful after all for this one final thing. He unfolded it and placed it on the table in front of him, and did not slide it across yet. I want it on record, he said, to the room, to no one specifically, that this organization is what my father built it to be. That whatever I did wrong, the organization itself is real. It matters. He stopped. His jaw moved once. I want that said before I sign this. No one spoke. He picked up the pen from the table, signed the document, set the pen down, slid the document toward Sal Ferrero. Sal took it, looked at it without reading it in detail, set it in front of him. Commission acknowledges receipt, Sal said. The transition of operational authority is confirmed as of today. He looked at Vivian. Boss Ashcroft. Vivian nodded. Dante pushed his chair back. He stood. He buttoned the middle button of his jacket, the same habitual gesture Marco used, the small automatic motion that belongs to a man's hands independent of everything else. And he looked at Sal Ferrero, at Colucci, at the Boston representative, at the New Jersey representatives. He did not perform anything with the look. He just looked, the way you look at a room you're leaving and won't see again, taking in the actual physical reality of it. Then he looked at Vivian. She was already looking at him. She'd been watching him the whole time. Her face was composed in the specific way he recognized. Not cold, not warm, not any of the performed versions of neutrality that he'd learned to see through over the years. Just present. Just exactly where she was. Without armor and without performance. He wanted to say something. He could feel the shape of it, the need for it, some word or sentence that would close what was between them in a way that felt adequate to its size. He'd had a version of it in his head since 4 a.m, standing at the kitchen window with his coffee. Something about understanding what she'd done and what it cost. Something that acknowledged the 14 years with the weight they deserved. He looked at her face and understood that there was nothing he could say that she hadn't already thought, already processed, already moved past in the way she'd moved past everything. Quietly, completely, without leaving loose ends. So he said nothing. He nodded once, not a bow, not a concession in the formal sense. Something more personal than that. Something between 2 people who had shared a long time and arrived at its end. He walked to the door. He opened it. He left. Irons. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then Luca Romano set his leather folder on the table and looked at Vivienne. "We have a lot to do," he said. "I know." She was still looking at the door. Then she looked away. "Let's start with the structure. The captains who transferred loyalty in the first 48 hours. I want to sit with each of them individually before we confirm anyone in their current role. That's 11 meetings. Schedule them across next week, 2 a day." She looked at Marco. "I want you with me for the first 3. Marco nodded. "Which 3? "Vincent Curo, the 2 New Jersey captains." She paused. "Vincent, I want to understand. He stayed loyal to Dante the longest. I want to know why it shifted." "Respect," Marco said immediately. "Not for Dante. For what the shift cost him." He looked at her. "He's a man who takes loyalty seriously. The fact that he came over means something. He'll be useful." "That's what I want to understand," she said. "Whether I'm right about him." Luca was writing. Marco was thinking. The commission representatives were conducting their own quiet conversation at the far end of the table around Sal Ferrero, the administrative aftermath of what had just happened, the procedural reality of a succession that was now complete. Vivienne looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the morning she'd left, the coffee at 4:15, the dark garden, the 4 seconds in the bedroom doorway. She thought about the laugh from the East Wing, the way it had moved through the house, the way she'd stood at the foot of the stairs and named what she felt with the precision she'd taught herself, because precision was the only thing that had kept her sane for 2 years. Confirmation. She'd called it confirmation. She'd been right. It was confirmation. It was exactly that. And now the thing that had been confirmed was done, was settled, was behind her in the specific way that things go behind you when you've finished with them completely. Not suppressed, not avoided, but actually finished. She picked up the pen Dante had left on the table. She turned it over once in her hand, looking at it. Then she set it down, capped. "Luca," she said. "Yes. After the capo meetings, I want to look at the Chicago arrangement. Petrov, the financial liaison. He's good at his job and he held when the accounts were flagged. I want to formalize his relationship with the organization. Proper structure. He's not family. He doesn't need to be family. He needs to be reliable and structurally positioned correctly." She looked at Luca. "Set up a call. This week?" "End of the week." She stood. Around her, the room began to come back to its ordinary functions. Chairs shifting, documents being gathered, the commission representatives standing and extending the particular formal courtesies that close these kinds of meetings. She shook Sal Ferrero's hand, and then Colucci's, and then the Boston representatives, and each handshake had the quality of a thing being made real through contact, through physical acknowledgement, through the specific weight of one person's hand in another's. Sal held her hand for an extra moment. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has watched a long time pass and is taking the measure of what it produced. "Carmine would have been satisfied," he said. Not proud, not impressed, satisfied. The specific word of a man who understood exactly what he was describing. Vivienne looked at him. "I know," she said. She picked up her coat. She walked to the door. Behind her, Luca and Marco were already talking, not about what had just happened, about what was next, about the specific practical work of the thing she'd built and what it required now. That was right. That was exactly right. That was what came after this. She walked out into the hallway of the club, which was carpeted and quiet and smelled of old wood and the particular airlessness of rooms that have been closed to the weather for a long time. She walked through it and through the lobby and out through the front door onto the Manhattan street, which was cold and immediate and specific in the way streets are, full of people with their own forward motion, their own concerns, their own entirely separate architecture of days and choices and small disasters and recoveries. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The cold moved through her coat and she let it. She looked up at the Midtown skyline, at the buildings that did what they always did, presented themselves, massive and indifferent, organized around the concerns of people with serious intentions. She had serious intentions. She put on her coat properly, buttoning it against the October air. Then she turned toward the car that was waiting at the curb. Luca already coming through the door behind her, Marco a half step behind him, the day already in motion, already being built. And she thought briefly and precisely about what the next 5 years would look like. Not the obstacles, not the threats, the actual shape of the thing she would build. It was a good shape. She got into the car. The door closed. Behind them, in the club's private dining room, Sal Ferrero sat at the head of the long table with Dante Moretti's signed resignation in front of him, and he looked at the door through which Vivian Ashcroft had walked, and he thought about Carmine Moretti, about a conversation they'd had 20 years ago in a room not entirely unlike this one, about a quality in people that Carmine had spent his whole life looking for and only rarely found, and he thought about the fact that Carmine had found it in his son's wife and had understood immediately what to do with that finding, and had done it, quietly and permanently, and had then waited, in the way of men who understand that what they've set in motion will take exactly as long as it takes. He picked up the signed resignation, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. Then he sat at the table by himself for a while in the quiet of the room, and outside the windows the city went on doing what cities do, indifferent, relentless, belonging to whoever was willing to understand it well enough to move through it without being moved by it. And the door stayed closed, and the table stayed empty, and the succession that had been building for 6 years and executed in 5 days was, as of this moment, completely and irrevocably. 5 years is enough time for a city to forget a man. Not immediately, not in the first year when his name still moved through certain conversations in the particular way of something recent, referenced sideways, with the careful non-specificity of people who have learned that names carry weight in proportion to how recently they mattered. In the first year, Dante Moretti was still a presence in the way that absence can be a presence, the shape of something that had been there and wasn't anymore, recognizable in its outline. By the second year, the outline had softened. By the third, it was mostly gone from the rooms that mattered. By the fifth, it was something closer to history. Not erased, not dishonored, but settled into the sediment of a world that had continued building itself on top of what came before. The way all worlds do, the way they have to, because the alternative is standing still in a room with someone else's furniture. The restaurant was small and off the kind of street that doesn't appear in guides. A narrow block in the West Village that had been the same narrow block for 40 years, with the same 3 establishments occupying its length, none of them particularly interested in being discovered. The kind of place that survives precisely because it asks nothing of the people who come to it. Dante had been coming here for 3 years. He'd found it by accident in the first months after the estate. After he'd sold the estate, which he'd done 14 months after the commission meeting, quietly, through an intermediary, to a family that had no connection to any of the world he'd left. And he'd found it the way you find things when you're not looking for anything specific, which is by simply moving through the city like someone who lives in it rather than commands it. He sat at his usual table, corner, not because he was watching the room. He wasn't watching the room, hadn't been watching rooms that way in years, but because it was the table with the best light in the afternoon. And he'd become, without particularly planning to, someone who cared about afternoon light. He was 51 years old. He looked it, not badly, not in the way of a man who had been broken by what happened to him, but honestly, the way a face looks when it stops being managed and just becomes what it is. He was drinking coffee and reading a book, which he did most afternoons. The book was about architecture, the specific engineering of structures that were meant to last, the principles underlying things built to outlive the people who built them. He developed an interest in this over the past 2 years that he understood, in the clear-eyed way he developed for looking at his own patterns, was not coincidental. He was drawn to the study of permanence, of things that held. The television mounted above the bar was on but muted, its captions rolling beneath the news broadcast, and Dante was not watching it in any active sense. It occupied the edge of his peripheral vision the way televisions do in places that keep them running through the day. He was on his second cup of coffee and a third of the way through a chapter about load distribution in Roman aqueduct construction when the broadcast changed. He noticed it without meaning to. The graphic that appeared in the corner of the screen was familiar in the specific way that certain things remain familiar even after years of deliberate distance. The shape of the commission's formal announcement format, the the kind of broadcast that only happened for significant organizational events. He'd seen that graphic format used 4 times in his life, and each time it had mattered. He looked at the screen properly. The caption read, "Moretti Syndicate announces international partnership with European criminal networks. Boss Ashcroft addresses commission." And then the broadcast cut to footage, and she was there. She was standing at a podium in what Dante recognized, even on a muted television screen with captions rolling beneath it, as one of the commission's formal venues. A room he'd been in, a room that had its own specific gravity in his memory, its particular dark wood and particular quality of light. She was wearing a black suit that fit her with the precision of something chosen rather than assembled, and her hair was different than it had been 5 years ago, shorter, and her face had the particular quality of a person who has been doing demanding work for a long time and has found, somewhere inside the demand, something that sustains them. She looked good. She looked like exactly what she was. Dante put his book down. He looked at the screen and watched her speak, watched her mouth move, watched the way she held the podium without gripping it, the way her eyes moved across the room she was addressing with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who knows the room and has earned knowing it. The caption scrolled. Under Boss Ashcroft's leadership, the Moretti Syndicate has expanded operational networks into 6 European markets over the past 3 years, establishing partnership agreements with affiliated organizations in... He stopped reading the caption. He watched her face. She was confident without the performance of confidence. That was the thing that struck him, watching her now with the specific clarity of 5 years of distance, the absence of performance. He'd known her for 14 years and had never understood what she was doing, had interpreted her composure as passivity and her silence as absence and her patience as limitation, and watching her now on a muted television screen in a West Village restaurant, he understood that what he'd been looking at all those years was a person who had never needed to perform because she had never needed to prove anything to anyone in the room. She'd been the most powerful person in every room she'd ever walked into. He'd just never been looking at what power actually looks like. The broadcast cut to another angle, and standing to her left, a half step back in the particular position of a man who operates as support rather than center, was Luca Romano. Dante looked at Luca. He'd thought about Luca Romano in the first year, had tried to trace the shape of when and how he'd entered Vivienne's planning, had run the timeline back trying to find the moment. He'd never been able to pin it precisely, which he now understood was because the precision didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd found the right person and given him the right role, and that the combination had produced something that worked. She'd done that the way she did everything, without waste, without announcement. He looked back at her face on the screen. The broadcast showed the room, commission representatives, a number of faces he recognized, and a significant number he didn't, the latter telling its own story about how the world had continued building while he'd been living outside of it. It showed people listening to her with the specific quality of attention that people give to someone they take seriously, not perform deference, not the attention of people who are afraid of the person speaking, but actual listening, the real kind. The kind that happens when what someone says is worth hearing. Then the broadcast cut to the anchor, and the graphic changed, and the moment passed. Dante picked up his coffee. It had gone slightly cool. He drank it anyway. The barista, a young man named Felix who'd worked here for 2 of the 3 years Dante had been coming, who knew his order and had at some point begun having the kind of brief daily conversations with Dante that constitute a specific quiet kind of human connection, came over with the carafe and refilled the cup without being asked. "You okay?" Felix said. Not with particular concern. It was the casual check-in of a person who has learned to read a regular's register. "Fine," Dante said. Then, after a moment, "Yeah, fine." Felix nodded and moved on. Dante sat with his refilled coffee and his book open to the chapter about load distribution and the television screen now showing something else entirely, and he sat with what he felt, which was his practice now. Sitting with things, naming them accurately, not building structure around them faster than they deserved. What he felt was not grief. It wasn't envy. It wasn't the specific corrosive thing he'd felt in the first year, which had been closest to rage but was really more like the sensation of a body that has lost a limb and keeps reaching for it. Phantom motion, phantom grip. The muscular memory of a shape that no longer existed. What he felt, sitting in the corner of a small restaurant in the West Village on an ordinary afternoon, watching a broadcast about the woman who had succeeded him in the only world he'd ever operated in, was something he hadn't had a word for until about 8 months ago. He'd been talking to a woman he'd met at a lecture at the public library, a lecture about urban planning, of all things, which he'd gone to because the description in the weekly program had mentioned structural longevity, which was the kind of thing he was interested in now. The woman's name was Catherine. She was a civil engineer, divorced, 2 adult children, with the particular quality of someone who had done hard work for a long time and was not theatrical about it. They'd had coffee after the lecture and then dinner 2 weeks later, and they'd been doing something that could reasonably be called seeing each other for 6 months. She didn't know what he'd been. He told her he'd worked in finance, which was technically true in the way that calling a hurricane wind is technically true. She hadn't pressed. She wasn't the pressing kind. She asked questions that were genuinely curious and listened to the answers and told him things about her own life with the same quality of genuine offering, and what he felt in her company was something new enough that he'd had trouble naming it. He'd named it, eventually. Ordinary. He felt ordinary with her. Not in the diminished sense, in the sense of belonging to the normal human texture of things. Dinners and books and the lecture circuit of the New York Public Library and arguments about what movie to watch, and the specific quiet of 2 people sitting in the same room doing different things. The ordinary that he'd spent 40 years treating as beneath him had turned out, at 51, to be the thing he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking. He thought about Catherine. He thought about the dinner they had planned for tonight, a Thai place she'd been wanting to try, a reservation she'd made herself, a Tuesday evening in October with no particular significance other than the one you give a thing by showing up to it. He thought about Vivian on the television screen, standing at the commission podium with her black suit and her shorter hair, looking exactly like what she'd always been. He thought about his father's voice. She's the smartest person in any room she walks into. He thought about the laugh in the East Wing morning room. He let himself feel the full shape of that, what it meant, what it said about the man he'd been, the particular precise failure of imagination that it represented. He didn't look away from it. He'd learned not to look away from things. Then he closed his book and finished his coffee and put on his coat. He walked home through the West Village in the October afternoon, which was cold and clear with the particular quality of October light in New York, low and golden, finding the edges of buildings, making ordinary stone look like something considered. He'd walked this neighborhood enough in 3 years that he knew it the way you know places you actually live in rather than pass through. Knew which block had the best trees, which corner caught the wind, which stretch of sidewalk was uneven enough to catch you if you were looking at your phone. He thought, walking, about Marco Iannetti. Marco had called him once, 14 months after the commission meeting. A brief call. He hadn't identified himself initially, and Dante had recognized his voice in the first sentence anyway, the way you recognize voices that have been part of your life's texture for long enough that they live in the body rather than the memory. I wanted to say something, Marco had said. Say it, Dante had said. A pause. I'm sorry for the way it went. Not what I did. I'm not sorry for that. But the way it went, the speed of it. I could have... He stopped, started again. I could have talked to you earlier. I chose not to. Dante had sat with that for a moment. He was in the estate at the time. He hadn't sold it yet, was still living in it with the particular strange quality of inhabiting a place that had changed its meaning, the way a room feels after something significant has happened in it. Why didn't you? He said. Because I didn't think you'd hear it, Marco said, and I didn't want to have the conversation that would have had to happen first before you could hear it. This was honest. Dante had recognized it as honest in the specific way you recognize things that were true before you were ready to know they were true. You were right, Dante said. Marco was quiet for a moment. How are you? I don't know yet, Dante said. I'll let you know when I figure it out. Marco had made a sound that was almost a laugh, brief, and with the texture of two men who have known each other a long time and can compress a great deal into a small sound. "All right," he said. "Take care of yourself." "You too, Marco." He hadn't heard from him since. He didn't expect to. That call had been what it was, a closing conducted by two people who understood closure, said what needed saying, and let it be done. The right shape for the end of a thing. He thought about Marco now, walking, and what he felt was something close to respect. Not the kind he'd had for Marco when they worked together, the transactional respect of a man for a useful asset, but something more considered. The respect of understanding what it had cost Marco to do what he did, and why he'd done it, and what it said about the kind of person Marco had always been underneath the 9 years of service to a man who hadn't deserved it. He turned onto his block. The building he lived in was a brownstone, 4 stories, a second-floor apartment with 2 bedrooms and windows that faced the rear courtyard rather than the street, which he'd chosen because he wanted quiet. He'd furnished it slowly, over months, with the deliberateness of someone learning a new skill, learning what he actually wanted a room to feel like rather than what he'd been told rooms were supposed to feel like. It looked like nothing in particular from the outside. Inside, it looked like someone lived there. He stopped at the front steps and looked up at his windows. The light was on in the living room, which meant Catherine was there. She had a key, had had one for 4 months, and sometimes came by in the afternoon when her work schedule allowed and would be reading or working at his table when he came home. And he'd understood the first time he'd come home to a lit window that this too was something he hadn't had a word for. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The October air was cold enough to see his breath. He watched it dissipate. He thought about Vivian one more time, not with the complex compressed weight of the first years, not with the phantom limb sensation of loss or the specific burn of understanding too late. He thought about her the way you think about the decisive experiences of your life when you've achieved some real distance from them, with the clarity that comes from no longer being inside the thing, from being able to see its actual shape rather than what you wished its shape was. She had not destroyed him. She had not tried to. She'd corrected a mistake, Marco's word and the right word, and she'd done it with a precision and patience that was itself a lesson if he'd been the kind of person who learned from lessons. He was trying now to be that kind of person. It was slower than he would have liked. It was honest. He thought about what she'd said at the commission meeting, answering a question he hadn't heard asked, and the caption had scrolled beneath her mouth. "We removed the weakness and protected what truly mattered." She had never said his name. In 5 years, in every broadcast, every reported statement, every piece of organizational communication that had made its way to him through the residual channels that a man can't entirely close off just by deciding to leave, she had never said his name. He'd understood in the first year that this was deliberate. He'd felt it as a wound, the specific cruelty of erasure, of being made not just absent, but unnamed, of being the mistake that isn't spoken because speaking it gives it too much weight. He understood it differently now. She wasn't erasing him. She wasn't protecting herself from the discomfort of his name. She simply had no further use for it. He had ceased to be relevant to the thing she was building. And when a thing ceases to be relevant to you, you don't speak about it. Not from cruelty. From completion. He had ceased to be part of her story. That was the truth of it, accurate and complete. She had written him out not by force, but by surpassing him so thoroughly that his chapter simply ended the way chapters end. Not with violence, but with the arrival of something more important. He breathed out, watched the breath go. Then he climbed the steps and opened the door to his building and went inside. Catherine was at the table with her laptop and a cup of tea that had probably gone cold. The particular absorption of someone who has forgotten the cup entirely. She looked up when he came in, and her face did what it always did when she looked at him. A small opening, genuine, the specific expression of someone who is glad to see a particular person and doesn't feel the need to perform the gladness. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He took off his coat, hung it. "Tea's cold." She looked at the cup. "It was hot when I made it." "I'll make you another one." He went to the kitchen. He filled the kettle and put it on and got down her mug and the tea she liked. A specific kind she'd left here months ago, the way objects begin to accumulate in a place when a person is genuinely present in it. He stood at the counter while the water heated and looked at the small courtyard through the kitchen window, which had a maple tree that was in the final stages of its October color, the leaves at the edge of releasing. "You're quiet," she said from the table. "I saw something on the news," he said. Not as a disclosure. As a fact, he was sharing the way you share facts with someone you've decided to be honest with. About? He thought about how to answer this. Not because he was managing her, but because he was finding the accurate sentence. "About someone I used to know," he said. "A long time ago." She was quiet for a moment. She didn't press. This was one of the things he'd come to depend on about her. The capacity to leave space. Good news or bad? Good, I think. For her. He found the right word. For the work she does. "That's a generous way to feel about it," Catherine said. He thought about this. "It's the accurate way," he said. The kettle came to a boil. He poured the water over the tea and let it steep the right amount of time. He'd learned how she liked it, had filed it away in the particular way he'd begun to file small, specific knowledge about this person, and brought it to the table and set it down beside her laptop. She looked up at him. Her eyes moved across his face in the way of someone reading a familiar text for something they might have missed. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. And then, because it was the accurate answer, not the managed one, "It just takes a minute sometimes." She nodded. She understood the shape of this without understanding its content, which was the right kind of understanding. She picked up the tea. "The reservation's at 7:30, she said. "We have time." "We have time," he said. He sat down across from her. He picked up his book, found the chapter on load distribution, and read. Upset. 3 blocks away, if he'd been walking west instead of north, he would have passed the building where Luca Romano kept an office that served as the Eastern Operations Center for the Moretti Syndicate's New York network. He didn't know the specific address. He hadn't tried to find it. This was part of the condition he'd asked for and been given. Not that they would stay out of his life, because that wasn't something they could guarantee, but that he would stay out of theirs, which was something he could guarantee, and had. In that office, at that moment, Luca Romano was reviewing the documentation from the European Partnership announcement, the legal architecture of 3 new agreements, the operational logistics of network integration across 6 markets, the specific careful work of expanding something that already worked into territory that would require new thinking and new relationships and new problems that were different from the old problems, but problems nonetheless. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. He was better now than he'd been 5 years ago, which was itself the sign of a healthy organization, that the people inside it grew rather than stagnated, that the work demanded more, and the people met the demand. He had a photograph on his desk. Not a personal photograph, though, a copy of the founding document, the provision Carmine Moretti had signed 9 years ago, the notarized statement that had started all of this. He'd framed it and put it on his desk, not as a monument, but as a reminder of what careful work looked like, what building towards something with patience and precision actually produced when it came to its completion. He looked at it sometimes when the work got complicated, which it always eventually did, because that was the nature of the work. He looked at it and thought about the specific quality of commitment it represented. Not Vivian's commitment, though that was real and enormous, but Carmine's. A man at the end of his life, looking at his son and his son's wife, and understanding clearly what he was seeing, making a decision that his son would experience as betrayal, and that his daughter-in-law would experience as the longest-running act of faith anyone had ever extended toward her. Carmine Moretti had believed in the right person. In the last year of his life, with everything he'd built at stake, he'd looked around the room and found the right person and done the specific careful thing that needed doing, and then he'd died. And the years had moved, and here they were. Luca thought that was worth keeping on a desk, worth looking at when the work got hard. Vivian Ashcroft returned to New York that same evening on a flight from Boston that landed at 6:40, delayed 20 minutes by weather over Connecticut. She didn't mind the delay. She used it to go through the operational summary Luca had sent, the week's numbers, the status of the European agreements, the 2 outstanding issues in the New Jersey network that needed attention before month's end. She had a car waiting. She always had a car waiting, because she was always somewhere and needed to be somewhere else. and the movement between was where she did some of her clearest thinking. She got in. The driver, a woman named Sandra, who had been driving her for 2 years, who was reliable and discreet, and had the specific professional quality of a person who understands that their function is to move someone efficiently rather than to occupy their presence, pulled onto the highway and settled into the rhythm of the drive back to the city. Vivian looked out the window at the highway moving past. At the Connecticut darkness, the exit signs, the ordinary infrastructure of a world going about itself. She was thinking about the European agreements, about the Chicago arrangement with Petrov, which had been working well for 4 years now, about Vincent Curro, who had turned out to be exactly what Marco had said he was, a man who took loyalty seriously, who had found in the new administration a structure worthy of that seriousness, who had become in the past 5 years one of the most reliable captains in the organization. She thought about Marco. He'd been tired lately, in the specific way of someone who has been doing demanding work for a long time and is beginning to feel the cumulative weight of it. She was going to have to talk to him about it, not to push him toward anything, but because she paid attention, and paying attention meant eventually addressing what you saw. She'd been thinking about who might serve as a deputy to his role, someone who could absorb some of the load without displacing him, because Marco's judgment and institutional knowledge were not things she was willing to lose. She had 2 names in mind. She'd talked to Luca about them this week. The city came into view through the windshield, its skyline doing what it always did from this distance and this angle, presenting itself as something that has always been there and will continue to be, indifferent to the specific lives being lived inside it, patient in the way that large things are patient. She looked at it. She thought very briefly about the dining room table, about the envelope she'd left there, about the drive to Connecticut, the rest area, the 2 hours she'd given herself, about standing outside in the cold and watching the traffic and letting herself feel the full shape of what she'd done. That had been 5 years ago. It was the kind of distance that, when you looked back across it, compressed itself into a clarity that the experience itself hadn't had. You could see the whole shape of it from here, the choice it had required, the cost of the patience, the specific loneliness of 2 years of careful, invisible work in a house where no one was paying attention to you, which was simultaneously your greatest advantage and the thing that ground you down in ways you only fully understood after it was over. She had been ground down. She didn't talk about this because it wasn't relevant to the work, but it was true. There had been nights in the second year where the weight of the sustained, invisible effort had pressed down on her in ways she hadn't anticipated and hadn't planned for, where the discipline she'd built and relied on had felt not like strength, but like the only thing standing between her and something she didn't want to look at. She'd been lonely. She'd been afraid, not of Dante, not of failure, but of the specific fear that comes from betting everything on your own judgment and not being able to know yet whether your judgment was right. She'd been right. The judgment had been right. But she remembered what it felt like not to know that. She kept the memory specifically because it was true, and because she'd decided at some point that the things that had cost her were worth knowing accurately, not for sentiment, for honesty. The car came off the highway and into the city proper, and the streets changed to the city's particular close texture, buildings and people, and the specific energy of a place with too much happening in too little space, which was what she'd always loved about it. She'd grown up in this city. She knew its rhythms. She moved through it differently now than she had 5 years ago, differently than she had 14 years ago when she was 28, and being brought to family dinners and being looked at as someone's wife, and being underestimated so consistently by so many people that it had felt, after a while, like a thing she lived inside rather than a thing that happened to her. She didn't live inside it anymore. The car pulled up in front of the building where she kept her primary residence, not the Moretti estate, which had been sold to strangers and was now, she understood, home to a family whose children played in the rear garden she'd once stood in at 4 a.m. watching the darkness lift. Her place was a building in the East 50s, 7 years old, with the clean lines of something built deliberately rather than accumulated. She'd chosen it herself. She'd furnished it herself. It was exactly what she wanted a room to feel like. Sandra pulled to the curb. "Same time tomorrow?" 6:30, Vivian said. "I have an early meeting." She got out. The night air was cold and immediate. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not for any particular reason, just the pause between one thing and the next, and looked up at the building's face, at the lights in the windows, at the city's specific ambient luminance that meant you could never see stars here, that the sky above Manhattan was always the color of what the city threw up at it. She thought about what Sal Ferrero had said in Boston. Carmine would have been satisfied. She'd said she knew. She did know. She'd known it for 6 years from the last serious conversation they'd ever had, sitting beside his bed with her hand in his, listening to a man say true things in the careful way of someone who understands time is limited and won't spend the remaining of it on anything that isn't true. He told her that afternoon that he was sorry. Not for what he'd done, Hess. He wasn't sorry for that. He was sorry for what he hadn't done earlier, which was look at his son clearly enough and early enough to prevent the specific waste that was coming. He'd said, "I built something worth protecting. I should have been more careful about who I gave it to." And then, looking at her, "I'm glad I had time to correct it." She'd held his hand and not said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. He knew she understood. He'd always known she understood. She went inside. The lobby was warm and quiet. The elevator came immediately. She rode it to the 8th floor and walked the hall and opened her door and went inside. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Everything in its place, the specific order of a person who lives alone and has been doing so long enough that the order is genuine rather than performed. She set her bag down, took off her coat, went to the kitchen and made herself tea, standing at the counter in the same posture she'd stood in at 4:15 in the morning, in another kitchen, in another life. Barefoot, waiting for water to heat. She drank the tea standing up, looking at nothing in particular, just being in the room. She had a call with Luca at 9 tomorrow morning. She had the New Jersey Captains Wednesday. The Chicago arrangement review Thursday. A conversation with Marco, important, needed, about the question of the deputy role, sometime this week when she could feel the right moment for it. She had a great deal of work. She finished her tea, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light. She walked to the window that looked out over the city, east, toward the river, across the grid of the thing that had always belonged to whoever was willing to understand it well enough, and she looked at it for a moment. The lights, the movement, the ordinary, relentless continuation. She had done what she'd set out to do. She stood at the window and let that be exactly what it was. Not triumph, not vindication, not the conclusion of a story that was still ongoing and would be ongoing and would continue to require from her everything she had to give and would give back something that was, by any accurate measure, worth it. She had removed the weakness. She had protected what truly mattered. She turned off the light and went to bed. And outside the window the city went on without her, the way cities do, the way they're supposed to, patient and indifferent and full of the specific anonymous light of 10 million people living their lives in the same place at the same time. None of them required to be remarkable. All of them just required to continue, to move through the days with whatever they had, to show up to the dinner reservations and the morning meetings and the October evenings when the light goes low and golden and the air has the taste of something ending and something that hasn't started yet, and the window stays lit or goes dark, and the street holds whoever's walking it, and the city keeps its own counsel, and the night comes down.